Grandma Rose's house always smelled like cinnamon and old books. It was a smell I loved, a smell that meant safety and warm cookies after school. But it was also the place where I learned that questions were like little stones you shouldn't throw. They made ripples, and Grandma Rose did not like ripples. I was 8, and my world was a giant bubbling pot of whys. Why was the sky blue? Why did cats purr? Why did my older sister Ava get to stay up later than me? Ava never asked why. She was 11, and she moved through the world like a calm little boat, following the currents Grandma set for her. I was more like a clumsy swimmer, always splashing and asking why the water was so wet. I remember one afternoon. The sun was streaming through the kitchen window, making dust bunnies dance in the light. Grandma Rose was at the counter, her hands covered in flour, rolling out dough for her famous apple pie. Ava sat at the table, quietly embroidering a handkerchief. It was a perfect picture, peaceful and still. I was supposed to be helping Ava, learning the neat, tiny stitches, but my needle was lying on the table. "Grandma," I started, my voice small in the quiet room. "Yes, Chloe," she said without looking up. Her focus was entirely on the dough, pressing and folding it with a gentle rhythm. "Why do we have to roll the dough this way? What if we made it into little balls instead? Or a square?" The rolling pins stopped. A silence fell over the kitchen, heavier than any of the quiet that had come before. Ava looked up from her handkerchief, her eyes wide, and gave me a tiny, almost invisible shake of her head. I knew that look. It meant, "Stop, Chloe, just stop." Grandma Rose slowly turned, wiping her floury hands on her apron. Her face wasn't angry, not exactly. It was tired. It was the same look she got when I tracked mud into the house or spilled juice on the rug. "Chloe, dear," she said, and her voice was soft, but it felt sharp. "You are not like your sister. Ava understands. You just need to obey. Now pick up your needle and help her. That's a good girl." The words hung in the air between us. "You are not like your sister." She said it all the time, but it never hurt any less. It felt like a door slamming shut, a door to a room where Ava and Grandma were, a room I wasn't allowed to enter. I looked at Ava. She was already bent back over her work, her needle darting in and out of the fabric, making perfect little flowers. She was a good girl. She obeyed. I didn't want to do embroidery. I wanted to know if a square pie would taste different from a round one. I wanted to know why my questions were bad when all they did was pop into my head like bubbles. I picked up the needle, but my eyes stung with tears I wouldn't let fall. I pricked my finger, a tiny drop of red blooming on my skin. It was another question, a silent one this time. Why did being me feel so wrong? The silence that followed my pricked finger lasted for the rest of the afternoon. It was a heavy, sticky silence that clung to everything, making the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sound like a drumbeat. Ava finished her embroidery, a perfect, colorful bouquet of flowers that Grandma Rose praised with a soft smile. My own piece of fabric sat beside me, empty except for the tiny, dark spot of my own blood, a small monument to my failure. A few days later, Grandma Rose decided we would all go to the weekend market in the town square. This was usually my favorite outing. The market was a kaleidoscope of smells and sounds that made my brain buzz with happy energy. There was the sweet scent of fresh strawberries, the earthy smell of potatoes still dusted with soil, the loud chatter of people haggling over prices, and the distant, cheerful melody of a man playing a guitar. It was a place where 1,000 whys could be born in a single minute, and I always felt like I might just find the answers to a few of them. As we walked, Ava held the wicker basket, her steps perfectly in sync with Grandma's. She pointed out the shiniest apples and the plumpest tomatoes, earning a nod of approval each time. She was a professional market goer. I trailed behind, my head on a swivel. My eyes caught on a woman selling soap carved into the most intricate shapes. Sleeping cats curled in a ball, tiny, detailed dragons, and smiling crescent moons. I tugged on Ava's sleeve first, thinking maybe she'd be interested too. "Ava, look," I whispered. "How do you think she gets the soap to do that? Does she use a tiny knife?" Ava glanced at the stall, then back at me, her expression flat. She gave a little tug on my hand, pulling me forward. "It doesn't matter, Chloe. Let's keep up with Grandma." Her message was clear. Don't get distracted. Don't ask. Don't draw attention. We continued on and stopped at a vegetable stall run by a cheerful-looking farmer with dirt under his fingernails and a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. His table was a rainbow of produce. My eyes landed on a pile of lumpy purple carrots. They were nothing like the smooth orange ones we bought at the store. They looked like they had been pulled from a fairy tale garden. "Grandma," I whispered, tugging on her sleeve. Why are those carrots purple? And why are they so bumpy? Are they sick? Before Grandma Rose could form a response, the farmer overheard me and let out a hearty chuckle. Not sick at all, little lady. A sharp question from a sharp one, he boomed, and my heart did a little flip. He pointed a dirt-caked finger at them. Those are heirloom carrots. They come in all sorts of colors. They look that way because that's how they grew, wild and free, not like the perfect ones in the big shops. Here, look at this. He picked up a tomato that was yellow on top and streaked with red on the bottom. Nature doesn't always color inside the lines, eh? His smile was so warm and genuine, a stark contrast to Grandma's tight-lipped patience. For a second, I felt a rush of pure joy. Someone understood. Someone thought my question was interesting, not annoying. I opened my mouth to ask another. Why were some wild and some not? But Grandma Rose's hand clamped down on my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Thank you, but we are not here to waste the man's time with silly questions, she said to the farmer, her voice stiff and cold. She pulled me away from the stall so quickly that I stumbled. Her cheeks were flushed, a faint pink I recognized as deep embarrassment. Chloe, you do not bother working people. It is not polite to make a spectacle of yourself. But he wasn't bothered, I pleaded, my voice trembling. He was nice. He called me sharp. He was telling me about the tomatoes. That's enough, she snapped, her voice a low hiss that was somehow louder than a shout. We walked in silence for a few minutes, the cheerful sounds of the market suddenly feeling distant and muffled. Then came the words I was waiting for, the words that always felt like a punishment. Why can't you be more like Ava? She understands how to behave. She has decorum. She doesn't draw attention for the wrong reasons. I looked ahead at Ava. She was walking perfectly, basket on her arm, looking straight ahead as if the entire exchange hadn't happened. She hadn't been interested in the soap or the carrots. She was good. She was quiet. We passed the man with the guitar, and his cheerful song now sounded mocking, like a secret I wasn't in on. In that moment, walking through the most exciting place in the world, I had never felt more alone or more wrong. The question bubbling inside me this time was one I didn't dare speak. Why was being quiet and good more important than being curious and learning something new? The attic was my own personal forbidden kingdom. Grandma Rose had declared it off limits, a dusty tomb of things best left undisturbed. To Ava, that was a rule as solid as the foundation of the house. To me, it was an invitation. On a relentlessly rainy Tuesday, when the world outside was a blurry watercolor of gray and green, the invitation became too loud to ignore. Ava was content in the living room, reading one of her books with a princess on the cover. Grandma was napping, her soft snores a rhythmic counterpoint to the drumming of the rain on the roof. The house was quiet, too quiet. My curiosity, however, was buzzing like a trapped bee. I crept up the stairs, my socked feet silent on the worn wooden steps. The pull-down string for the attic stairs hung like a challenge. I dragged a chair over, climbed up, and pulled. The ladder unfolded with a groan, like an old man waking from a long sleep. The air that hit my face was thick and smelled of dust, cedar, and time itself. It was dark, but a single round window at the far end let in just enough gray light to see. The space was filled with ghosts of furniture covered in white sheets, stacks of old newspapers tied with string, and forgotten toys from a childhood that wasn't mine. In the farthest corner, tucked under the eaves, was a large, dark green trunk bound with leather straps. It didn't look like it belonged to Grandma. It felt different. With a grunt, I heaved the heavy lid open. Inside, my breath caught. This wasn't a trunk of old blankets or winter clothes. This was a box of secrets. On top lay a thick, leather-bound book with no title. Beneath it was a strange-looking metal tool that looked like a star finder and a series of maps, not of our town, but of places with names I couldn't pronounce. I carefully lifted the heavy book. The pages were filled with dense, looping handwriting and detailed sketches of birds, plants, and strange, wonderful insects. It was a journal. It had to be Grandpa's. I never knew him. He had died long before I was born. Grandma never ever talked about him. I didn't dare take the whole book. Instead, I carefully tucked one of the smaller maps into the waistband of my pants. It was a drawing of a coastline, with jagged rocks and a symbol of a lighthouse. I closed the trunk, pushed it back exactly as I had found it, and tiptoed back down, my heart thumping with the thrill of discovery. I found Grandma Rose in the kitchen, sipping a cup of tea. The rain had softened, and a weak light was trying to push through the clouds. I couldn't hold it in. The secret was too big, too exciting. "Grandma," I said, pulling the map from my pants. It was a little crinkled, but the drawing was clear. "I found something. I think it was Grandpa's. The change was instant and terrifying. The tired lines on her face didn't just deepen, they hardened. The teacup clattered as she set it down, her hand trembling. She snatched the map from my hand, her eyes blazing with a fire I had never seen before. It wasn't embarrassment or annoyance. It was anger, raw and deep. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice a low growl. In the attic," I stammered. "In a big green trunk. There's a book, Grandma, with drawings of birds and—" "You went into the attic? I told you never to go in the attic." Each word was a slap. "You go into my private things, you dig up what should be left in peace?" "I just wanted to know," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "I wanted to know about him. You never say his name, You just don't listen." She cut me off, her voice rising. "That's what you do, Chloe. You don't listen, you don't respect, you don't obey. You just push and pry and ask why. She crumpled the map into a tight ball in her fist. "Your grandfather was a man who was never satisfied. He was always looking for something else, something over the next hill. He filled his head with questions and plans, and it brought nothing but heartache. He was a dreamer who forgot the people right in front of him." She took a ragged breath, her shoulders slumping as if the anger was too heavy to hold. She looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a terrible, aching sadness. "Ava would never have done this," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The crumpled map fell from her hand onto the floor. "She knows some things are not meant to be disturbed. She understands that peace is found in accepting what is, not in chasing what was. You are not like your sister. I just pray you don't end up with the same restless heart that caused so much pain." She turned and left the kitchen, leaving me alone with the crushed piece of my grandfather's world. This time, the words felt different. They weren't just a comparison. They were a curse. My questions weren't just annoying. They were dangerous. They could cause heartache. They were the same questions that had made my grandfather forget his family. And for the first time, I was truly scared of the whys that lived inside me. I stood frozen in the kitchen for a long time, the silence ringing in my ears long after Grandma Rose had gone. The only sound was the faint, steady drip of the rain outside. My eyes were fixed on the crumpled ball of paper on the floor. It looked small and sad, a discarded piece of trash. But I knew it wasn't. It was a piece of my grandfather. It was a piece of me. Slowly, I bent down and picked it up. My hands trembled as I carefully uncrumpled it. The sharp creases made it look like a spider's web, but the lines of the coast and the little drawing of the lighthouse were still there. It felt like holding a secret, a dangerous and precious thing. I didn't know what to do with it. Throwing it away felt like throwing away a part of myself. Keeping it felt like an act of defiance. I chose defiance. I folded the map into a tiny square and hid it in the one place I knew no one would ever look, inside the hollowed-out body of an old porcelain doll whose face I had accidentally broken a year ago. She sat on a shelf in my room, a silent keeper of my new secret. In the days that followed, a change came over me. I decided that if I couldn't get rid of the whys that lived in my head, I would just have to bury them. I would become the girl Grandma Rose wanted. I would become a shadow of Ava. I started waking up and getting dressed without a single complaint about my itchy wool socks. At breakfast, I didn't ask why the jam was a different color today. I just ate my toast. When Grandma asked me to weed the garden, I didn't ask why some plants were weeds and others were flowers. I just pulled. I sat with Ava for hours, fumbling with my embroidery, my stitches clumsy and uneven next to her perfect, tiny knots. I didn't enjoy it. My mind wandered to the clouds, to the birds singing outside, to the shape of the leaves on the trees. But whenever a why started to form, I would squash it down, picturing Grandma Rose's angry, disappointed face. Ava seemed to notice the change, though she never said anything directly. One afternoon, as we were sitting on the porch, she glanced over at my quiet hands. "You're getting better at the cross-stitch," she said, her voice neutral. It wasn't a compliment, just an observation. "I'm trying," I mumbled, not looking up. The silence stretched between us, and I could feel the ghost of a question on her lips. I think she wanted to ask me what had happened, why I had suddenly gone so quiet. But Ava, ever the good girl, didn't ask. She let the silence lie, undisturbed. In her world, that was the kindest thing to do. My new quietness did not go unnoticed by Grandma Rose. A few days after the attic incident, she found me sweeping the front porch without being asked. I was concentrating on making neat piles of leaves, my mind blessedly empty. She watched me for a moment, and then she came over and placed a hand on my head. Her touch was gentle. "That's my good girl. she said softly. See how peaceful it is? See how nice it is when you're helpful and calm? I looked up at her, and she was smiling. It wasn't a tired smile or an annoyed smile. It was a genuine, warm smile, the kind she usually saved for Ava. A part of me felt a surge of warmth. I had done it. I had earned her approval. But another part of me felt a cold, hollow ache. This approval wasn't for me. Not the real me. It was for the girl I was pretending to be. I just nodded and went back to my sweeping. The hardest part was that the world didn't stop being interesting. I would see a spider meticulously weaving a web between the rose bushes, and my fingers would itch to touch it, my mind screaming to know how it made the silk so strong. I would see a rainbow after a storm and want to know why it was an arc and not a straight line. Each time, I would force myself to look away. I would bite my lip and concentrate on being still, on being empty. It felt like holding my breath underwater. One evening, I was helping Grandma sort through a basket of old clothes to be turned into rags. Near the bottom was a man's shirt. It was made of a thick, coarse blue fabric, unlike any of Dad's shirts. It was worn at the elbows and the collar was frayed. I held it for a moment, the rough material strange against my skin. Grandma glanced over, and her hands stilled in the pile of laundry. For a split second, her entire face changed. The stern mask she always wore slipped, and her expression became soft, distant, and filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull at the air around her. It was a look of profound loss. As quickly as it came, it was gone. She snatched the shirt from my hands. "This one is too worn. It's for the rag pile," she said, her voice clipped and businesslike. I said nothing. The old Chloe would have asked, "Whose shirt was it, Grandma? Why does it make you sad?" But the new Chloe just nodded. I watched her put the shirt away, but I couldn't stop the question from planting itself in my mind. It didn't bubble up this time. It settled deep inside me, like a seed falling into dark soil, waiting. I had learned to be quiet, but I was beginning to realize that some questions didn't need to be spoken to exist. 4 years passed. 4 years of being the good Chloe. On the outside, the change was remarkable. I grew my hair long like Ava's. I learned to sit still for hours, my hands folded in my lap. My voice became softer. I mastered the art of smiling politely and saying nothing. I became a ghost in my own life, haunting the spaces where a curious, loud, messy girl used to be. Grandma Rose was pleased. The house was peaceful, but peace felt a lot like being empty. I was 12 now, and the whys hadn't disappeared. They had just gone into hiding. They lived in the back of my mind, quiet and patient. I had buried them, but like seeds, they had taken root in the dark. The memory of the attic, of my grandfather's crumpled map, and of the raw pain in my grandmother's eyes was the soil they grew in. I had kept the map, still tucked inside the broken doll, a silent promise to a part of myself I refused to let die completely. The breaking point came on a clear, cold autumn night. Grandma and Ava were already asleep. I was supposed to be in bed, but I had crept to the window and pushed it open, letting the crisp air flood my room. The sky was a vast, dark blanket pricked with a million glittering holes. I remembered the starfinder I had seen in my grandfather's trunk. I wondered if he had ever looked at these same stars and asked the same questions that were now whispering in my mind. Why are they so far away? Are there other people looking up at them from other places? The whispers became a roar. I couldn't hold my breath anymore. My hands moved before my mind had fully caught up. I pulled the chair to my closet, retrieved the broken doll from the top shelf, and carefully shook out the folded, crinkled map. I stared at it under the moonlight. The lighthouse. The jagged coast. It was a destination. But the map wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed the book. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept out of my room and up the stairs to the attic. This time, I wasn't a clumsy child driven by impulse. I was on a mission. The ladder groaned, and the same smell of dust and time greeted me. I moved with a new confidence, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I went straight to the green trunk. It was just as I had left it. I lifted the lid, and there it was, the heavy, leather-bound journal. Back in my room, tucked under my blankets with the flashlight, I opened it. The looping handwriting was difficult to read at first, but I was determined. And as I deciphered the words, my world cracked open. He was just like me. The pages were filled with whys. Why do geese fly in a V? Why does moss only grow on the north side of trees? He hadn't just written questions. He had sought answers. There were detailed sketches of bird wings, notes on weather patterns, drawings of wildflowers with their roots exposed. He wasn't a man who forgot his family. He was a man who was deeply in love with the world. Then I found it. An entry dated years before I was born. October 10th, it read, "Walk the coast to the old lighthouse again. Rose thinks I waste my time, that I should be focused on the shop. But how can I explain to her what it feels like to stand there? At low tide, the sea pulls back and reveals the cove. The afternoon sun hits the wet stones, and the beach sparkles. It's covered in sea glass, a million broken pieces of green and blue and brown, made smooth by the ocean. All those sharp edges, tumbled by the waves until they become jewels. It reminds me that even broken things can be made beautiful again." Tears streamed down my face, silent and hot. Even broken things can be made beautiful again. He was talking about glass, but I knew he meant more. He meant people. He meant me. The broken doll, the crumpled map, the crushed questions. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I found Ava in the garden, pruning the roses with the same careful precision she applied to everything. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. "Ava," I said. I held out the open journal and the map. "I need to show you something. This was Grandpa's." She looked from the book to my face, her own expression clouding with alarm. "Chloe, no, put it back. Where did you get that? Did you go into the attic again?" "Just listen," I pleaded. He wasn't what Grandma said. He was wonderful. He was a scientist, an artist. He loved the world. Look, he wrote about a place, a cove by the lighthouse. I want to go there. I want you to come with me. Ava took a step back, her hands dropping the pruning shears into the basket. Her face was pale. "Are you crazy? Grandma would be furious. It's disobedient. She told you to leave it alone. Why can't you ever just leave things alone?" "Because it matters," I said, my voice rising with a passion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. "This is who I am, Ava. It's who he was. Don't you ever wonder? Don't you ever want to know more than what we're told?" "No," she said, and her answer was as sharp and final as a slammed door. "I don't. It's not our place. Our place is here, being good, helping Grandma, being peaceful. What you're doing is not peaceful, Chloe. It's selfish. And it's going to cause so much pain, just like she said." She turned her back on me and walked back toward the house, leaving me standing alone in the garden. The rejection stung more than I could have imagined. But underneath the hurt, something else was solidifying. It was resolve. I finally understood. Ava and I were two different people, walking two different paths. She found safety in following the rules. I had to find out what was on the other side of them. She wasn't going to come with me. And for the first time, I knew that was okay. Some journeys you had to make by yourself. That night, I packed a small bag. A bottle of water, an apple, the journal, and the map. The why was no longer just a question. It was a destination.